Hello everyone, thank you for taking a few moments to view this video on quasi-experimental designs. Now, what I'd like to do right before we get into the heart of the matter is I'd like to give you some additional information about these types of designs. Now, this will make even more sense as we get to the next video on true experimental designs. So, with quasi-experimental designs, we utilize these designs when randomization is not possible, warranted, or feasible. Now, what we're referring to here when we make this statement is really this term randomization. And so if you've had an opportunity to view the previous videos, randomization here refers to the letter R. And it's a letter that we have not used yet. And so we won't see the letter R for our quasi-experimental studies or designs, but we will see that letter when it comes to our true experimental designs. So keep this in mind, and I think it'll help make more sense as you look at the next video. Now, the first type of design that I'd like us to take a look at is what's called the time series design. Now, this type of design gives us the ability to collect multiple points of data over the course of time. So we have this scenario here to the left-hand side, but what I'd like to do first is I'd like to write out our experimental notation, and then what we'll do is we'll talk through it as we go along. Now, here's what we'll do. For this design, we're going to list 4 observations, and we're going to list the number by each of these. And so now that we have our 4 observations, we're now going to put the letter T, and we'll have 4 more observations after it, and we'll continue with the number 5 here. So let's look at our scenario here, and let's see if we can make sense of what's taking place. Coach Ricketts is the new coach at Uptown University, and he wants to see if his coaching and or teaching style makes a difference on how well the basketball players shoot the basketball during practice. To do this, he tests each of them on their free throws, jump shots, and three-point shooting, and their ability to play defense. He then implements schemes to assist his players in improving and then assesses them again. So right before we get started here, let's try to identify our independent variable, and let's also try to identify our dependent variable. So here's what I'd like you to see. The thing that's being implemented into this particular study is a new coaching or teaching style. So that's the independent variable. Okay, perfect. Now, the next thing that we'll identify here, again, is the dependent variable. And what we're looking at for the dependent variable is an assessment of each of those things that we saw listed earlier. So the coach wants to assess how well his athletes shoot free throws, jump shots, how well they shoot three-pointers, and how well they play defense. So just to make this easier for us, we'll again say that for our dependent variable, we are doing some kind of assessment of performance. So great. So now let's see if we can identify what each of these letters mean for our experimental notation. So, again, keep in mind that the coach wants to assess free throws. So, he's going to watch how well his athletes shoot free throws, and we'll just abbreviate that as FT. We're going to watch to see how well the athletes perform their jump shots. So, that'll be our second observation. We'll look to see how well they shoot their three pointers, and we'll look at how well they play defense. Now, here comes our T. We've identified this earlier. Again, our T is our treatment, or it's our independent variable. And so after the coach has implemented his coaching and teaching style, we're going to have an assessment of those same things again. But right before we go into that, I'll make sure that we label that this is the coaching style here. And then again, right after this, we're going to have the assessment of those same things. We're going to assess free throws, jump shots, three pointers, and also defense. So let's use this to talk about something that we've looked at previously. For our dependent variable, since we're talking about the assessment of performance, if I were to ask you what are the levels of the dependent variable, could you guess what they are? Right, they are the free throws, the jump shots, the three pointers, and the defense. So hopefully wanted to connect some dots there. So this again represents our time series design. Let's take a look at another example here. Our next example is what we call the reversal design. And just like we've done before, let's go ahead and start by listing our experimental notation first. And then we'll look at our scenario to see if we can identify what's taking place. Now, for the reversal design, let's start by identifying two observations. And we'll put a T right next to it. We'll follow this by listing two more observations, but we'll label this as observation 3 and observation 4. And now we're going to put a second treatment here. So because we have a second treatment, we're going to come back here and label our first treatment. Now, right after that, we're going to put two more observations, and we'll continue labeling this as observation 5 and observation 6. So let's take a look at our scenario and see if we can identify what's taking place. An experimental drug has been developed. The scientists that developed the drug wish to assess its effectiveness. To start, they complete two observations of the group they're studying to achieve baseline data. The scientists then introduce the new drug. After having introduced the drug, the scientists observe the group on two occasions to denote the effectiveness of the drug. The scientists introduce the drug once again and follow up by reassessing its effectiveness. So again, if we just simply identify our independent variable and our dependent variable, I think that's going to help us to get a better understanding of what's taking place. So of course, our independent variable here is going to be this new drug that has been developed. And so if we're underlining here, we'll say that it's this experimental drug. And so, of course, our dependent variable here is the outcome. It's what we're looking for. And so we'll talk about this more in just a second. But for now, we're going to say it's the outcome of the drug. And we can add to this by saying the effectiveness. So let's just say that this new drug is being used to treat heart conditions. And so let's imagine that our first observation here is going to represent an assessment of someone's heart rate and their blood pressure. Let's imagine that the same is going to be true for the second observation, meaning it's meant to assess their heart rate and blood pressure. And then our first T represents the treatment. It represents this new experimental drug that we're giving to the patients. So we'll just put ED here to represent the fact that this is the experimental drug. And so now that we've given this experimental drug, the next thing that we can do is follow up again by assessing the heart rate and blood pressure. And we could do that for 2 more occasions here. Now we've come to the treatment again, and what we could do is to administer that drug once again, our experimental drug, and we'll follow it out by doing the exact same thing that we've done before. We could assess someone's heart rate and blood pressure for 2 more observations. So here's what we need to make sense of. Well, why would we do this? Well, again, this gives us an opportunity to follow someone or a group of people over the course of time to see how well a drug impacts them. And this is very similar to what we'll see in some clinical trials. So let's look at our last example here for the quasi experimental designs group. The next one is what we call the non-equivalent control group. Now, this non-equivalent control group is going to look a little bit familiar to you. So let's look at our experimental notation first, and then we'll kind of identify the components of it in just a moment. So if you're writing with me, please feel free to create our dotted line here, because this will represent the fact that, again, we have 2 groups. Now, for the first group, we're going to list an observation, we're going to list a treatment, and a second observation. Now, for the second group, we're going to list a third and a fourth observation. Now, right underneath this T, kind of like we talked about before, even though we don't see anything, doesn't mean that there isn't something there. So as our placeholder, we're going to place the letter C to represent a constant. So let's imagine that we're looking at the same scenario that we did just a moment ago. Here's the scenario. This same group of scientists decides to test the new drug utilizing a different method. This time, they decide to have 2 groups. One group will receive the new drug, and the other group will not receive the new drug. However, both groups will be assessed or observed both before and after a treatment has been given. So let's identify what's taking place here. Let's start with what we've done previously. Let's identify what the independent variable is and what the dependent variable is. So we would say with great certainty that, again, our independent variable is this new drug, and previously we called it the experimental drug, but it's the same thing. So our independent variable is this new drug, and our dependent variable is essentially going to be the outcome of the given drug. Or we can identify it as its effectiveness. So again, as we identify each of the things here, our O1 would essentially represent kind of our first treatment. So let's keep it kind of the same as what we did last time. Let's imagine that our first observation here represents the assessment of someone's heart rate and blood pressure. The T represents the new drug. And our second observation also represents an assessment of someone's heart rate and blood pressure. Now, in the second group, we have a similar setup. The first O, or the first observation, again represents an assessment of heart rate and blood pressure, And the same is true for our fourth observation. So let's identify now, well, what is this C here in the middle? What is that going to represent? And like we looked at earlier this week, this C could actually represent something that we call the placebo. So what this gives us an opportunity to do is to see, is there a difference between the use of this new drug and a placebo? And so ultimately what this is going to help us do is to see, does this new drug work better than nothing at all? Because that's what our placebo is. It's really a non-treatment. So that's what the non-equivalent control group allows us an opportunity to do. We have the opportunity to look at two groups and to compare whether or not the new drug works against a placebo. So that's the last experimental design that we'll look at for the group that we call quasi-experimental designs. I'll see you in the next video as we look at the final section, which we call true experimental research designs.